Hello, hello! Welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course, my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains lost and forgotten, abandoned, cast out from this society. And today, we are going to discuss train graveyards. It seemed a bit fitting to do something spooky, continuing the trend of spooky month. It is October after all, Halloween time. I've been trying to focus on more spooky-ish topics to cover. And, well, what is a train graveyard or a train cemetery or whatever you want to call it? It varies. But long story short, if you've stumbled upon a group of abandoned rolling stock, whether the tracks are there or not, you could call it a train graveyard. There's quite a number of things that could be called that, quite a number of places that are considered train cemeteries simply because the stuff is abandoned and it's not really going to be moved or claimed or restored anytime soon. Rolling stock that is in a train cemetery or graveyard isn't considered preserved usually because it is by its nature completely abandoned. It's not being preserved, it's not being sheltered, it's not being taken care of at all. So here's 5 train graveyards to chill your spine. The New River Scenic Railway Graveyard. This is a bit of a limited choice. It's actually a lot more recent than most of the choices on this list, and it's only because the story surrounding this particular train graveyard is a little sad. It's also one of the smallest, since there's only just one locomotive as well as the cars that it was supposed to pull. And it did pull them for a few years before being abandoned, effectively. The locomotive in question is an Alco RS3. It's attached to 2 cars. This locomotive and her train used to be part of a scenic railway, which doesn't really count as a preservation railway, necessarily, as the whole point is for trips through a scenic area. This is in Tennessee, about an hour outside of Knoxville, and it sits next to the Oneida Line. The line itself was mostly used to haul coal and timber, but when that wound up drying up, it was abandoned, which was in 2004, but it was revived in 2006, when the National Coal Company bought it for $2 million, and then used it to move coal from its mining operations. But it had extra capacity, they weren't using it that much. So, in 2008, someone had a different idea for how to use the line more effectively. 2 friends, Scotty Phillips and Jimmy Burge, wanted to help the struggling rural area by trying to bring tourism out there. So they launched the New River Scenic Railway, using the RS3 locomotive which they got from Arizona, as well as a commuter car from Canada and the combination car from New York. They thought they could use the rail line to give passengers a tour through the history of Tennessee's railroads, all while they enjoy a view of the beautiful mountain terrain. Though they got the RS3 from Arizona, apparently it was originally from Pennsylvania. It was first used by the Reading Railroad. They also repainted the diesel in classic Southern Railway colors, while the cars were painted in Norfolk and Western colors. At first it actually went alright. They took nearly 3,000 people on a 62-mile journey over the course of a few years. But when the Great Recession happened, the National Coal Company liquidated its assets, and they sold 41 miles of track to R.J. Corman Railroad Group of Kentucky. R.J. Corman wasn't interested in allowing the New River Scenic Railway to use the line, and they were forced to park the diesel along with the coaches in a siding in 2009. The owners tried to work with R.J. Corman about the issue, but any efforts they made were met with a solid no. And all the while, the diesel and the coaches just kept deteriorating. And then in 2013, R.J. Corman stopped using the line as well, while still denying permission for Phillips and Burge to use it either. The RS3 and the coaches have been left to rot. The owners did admit that at first they tried to maintain her as best they could, but with no income from their operations, there was only so much they could do. And, as they put it, anytime they went to fix something, they found something else that was also broken. Phillips, as of 2021, noted that the money it would cost to repair everything would be about $600,000, So, that's actually horrifying. Oh my god. In 2020, R.J. Corbin filed a notice of abandonment with the U.S. Surface Transportation Board. Locals, the Northeast Tennessee Rail Authority, and the Arkansas-Oklahoma Railroad tried to save the line by appealing with the STB, though eventually the STB denied all appeals when it came to this. Some sources say that there was plans to use it for off-rail tourism at some point once it's removed from the spot it's been left in, but I'm not actually sure what that even means. How do you have rail tourism without rails? What? Maybe they were going to turn it into some kind of restaurant sort of deal? I've seen that happen, but apparently anything involving that fell through, and Phillips allegedly doesn't even own the locomotive anymore. Most sources peter out after 2021, and I'm not even sure if it's still there at this point. Possibly, but at this time, it seems well and true that this diesel and her coaches have been abandoned. The train graveyard of North Yorkshire. This site sits near Thirsk and can be sourced well back to Yep. That's about right. Speaking of them, though, there's some new merch in the shop, just in case you're interested. There's the Beaching Axe, as well as Chad British Rail, which I think is pretty funny to me. I don't know, maybe you like it. Maybe you don't, or maybe you don't have to. It's just there. It's new. You can get it if you want. Just saying. Anyway, the graveyard doesn't actually have any locomotives in it as far as I understand, so we don't have to deal with that. What we do have, though, are a bunch of rotting Mark II coaches. Roughly 7 of them, to be exact. Based on sources, it seems like they were moved from a site when they didn't sell at auction. I guess they couldn't scrap them for whatever reason, or it was just more cost-effective to just let them sit. Maybe they thought they'd get buyers in the future. But, yeah, they're still there, as far as anybody knows. They're just sitting, chilling, rotting away, as one does. And that seems to be the issue with plenty of these forgotten railroad graveyards. Railways that will either go under or just forget about rolling stock they have. They have no use for the old stuff, but they either forget to scrap it, or financial reasons mean they can't. Sometimes economically, it's not feasible to scrap something. It sounds weird, but sometimes scrap metal is near worthless, depending on what's going on in the market at that point. It's entirely possible British Rail just didn't see a reason to scrap them, as it was more cost-effective to just leave them in a spot out of the way until they could decide what to do with them later. And they never got around to the later part, so they're still sitting there. And I should probably mention at this point that many of these train graveyards are still considered on private property, so don't go looking for these places and think you can just walk in without express permission from the property owners. Despite being effectively abandoned, the property is still owned, and sometimes people don't appreciate when you trespass. It is a criminal offense, so this video in general is by no means encouraging anyone to go searching for any of these lost locomotives or rolling stock unless you have the property owner's specific permission. So it's probably best you don't go kicking that hornet's nest and possibly get yourself in a whole heap of trouble. Though I think these abandoned coaches really spell out why people are sometimes fascinated with these train graveyards. Frankly, the whole thing is a little creepy. Seeing these rusted out, former glorious rail cars just left, abandoned, to rust away. It really is like looking at death. Maybe these things weren't literally living, but especially to rail fans, there was a time where these things would have had stories to tell. They're a part of history, and they're being left to just disappear, being taken back by the march of time. The Eagle Lake and West Branch Railroad train graveyard. Okay, now we're getting into good stuff. As far as this list goes, this graveyard is the oldest one. It dates back to the 1930s, and it was originally part of what was known as the Eagle Lake and West Branch Railroad. That railroad was a rather small one, and it didn't last particularly long because when the Great Depression hit, well, they had to cease operations like a lot of places did. They would have run from Eagle Lake to Umbazookskus Lake, which I'm hopefully saying correctly because wow, Maine. And yes, this is in Maine. The locomotives that are there, well, there's at least 2 of them based on sources. Getting to this spot may be possible, as no sources mention it being private property. It may be, but it's really out there in the wilderness, like literally in the middle of nowhere. 2 steam locomotives, at least, sit, as well as a whole bunch of other railway infrastructure like abandoned track and tools and things of that nature. Given the fact that they've been sitting there nearly 100 years, they're actually not in that bad a shape. But like I said, in this case, this graveyard happened because the railway simply stopped being a thing. They went out of business, and they apparently didn't have enough money to even scrap the locomotives, though it's entirely possible that scrap metal was worthless in those days because of the Depression. In any event, they just left them there, and that's where they've been sitting ever since. I think the bigger issue with these 2 would probably be getting them out of where they're at. Like I said, they're in the middle of the forest, the countryside, like completely out there. So you would have to do a lot to get them not there anymore. You'd have to clear a ton of forest, a ton of overgrowth. You'd have to be able to move the engines in general, because they certainly aren't going to go under their own power, and you'd have a place to put them. Basically, this would be really expensive if you wanted to preserve these 2. I think it's worth it, because, I mean, they're not underwater, although, to be fair, I think some of my underwater trains that I've talked about might be a bit more accessible, but also, they're not underwater, they're right there. You could, in theory, move them to a place and possibly give them some level of restoration for the future. But right now, it doesn't seem like anyone's expressed interest in doing that. People just want to leave them. As a curious landmark in American railroad history. Do I think they should be moved? Yes, I do. But I also don't have the money nor means to do that, so it won't be me who's gonna do it. Now, there's a lot of websites that tell people how to get to this spot, but I want to stress caution here, because in this case the terrain could be considered very dangerous. Out there it'd be easy to get lost, and you definitely want to go prepared, and if you're not an experienced hiker, then probably take an experienced hiker with you. You definitely don't want to just go off by yourself, not tell anyone where you're going, then get lost in the woods and possibly eaten by a bear. I just don't want to see that happen to any of you. I think that'd be bad in general, so yeah, be careful when you're hunting for long-lost abandoned locomotives. The Winslow Junction train graveyard. Now, I do want to say this right now. I know for a fact that this place, it is explicitly forbidden for you to go there without explicit permission. So, I told you. You can't say I didn't. Don't actually go here unless the people that own it say you can. And I believe that is the New Jersey government. Just throwing it out there. Now, like I just said, this is in New Jersey. Specifically, Winslow Junction, which is located in Winslow Township. The junction was about halfway between Philadelphia and Atlantic City, and it wasn't that long ago that it was exceedingly busy. It occupied space used by several different railways, but when ridership declined, so did this spot. Over time, as those railways failed, it became better to just leave the rolling stock there rather than try to move it. Even for scrapping purposes, it just wasn't worth it, and the nearby station was shuttered in 1983. The property was turned over to the state, who still owns it, and many old diesels and cars are still there now, being left to waste away. Now, to their credit, the New Jersey government has sold off some of the rolling stock to various heritage railways, as well as museums, but they haven't really gone out of their way to donate a lot of it, it seems, and unless someone's willing to buy it, they haven't seen a need to get rid of it. Like I said, it is forbidden to go there unless you have express permission, though you can actually see the site from the nearby highway, as well as Spring Road. I don't know how easy it would be to get permission, because I think the state sees it as kind of a risk. There's a lot of dilapidated cars and locomotives. If you go inside, there is a reasonable chance for you to possibly get hurt on something, well, sharp, or who knows what. Tetanus, people. Tetanus is a thing. I'm just throwing it out there. But the place is definitely spooky, and it's really sad to see some of these classic diesels being left to waste away. I'm happy for the ones that got saved, but as it stands, it seems like there's plenty that still don't have a permanent home. They've just been left in the graveyard. And if time marches on, they may stay that way. The Windber Trolley Graveyard. This will be a fun one, as I kind of get to talk about streetcars, which don't come up super often in my videos, though I kind of wish they would. And I've just always found streetcars to be cute, and I kind of wish they had lasted a lot longer past their era. Like, I just don't care for buses. I don't like buses very much. Streetcars, though, love those things. Now, that being said, what's with the graveyard? Why are there so many in a graveyard? Why were they abandoned? Well, a lot of streetcars were abandoned when streetcars stopped being used, and many were scrapped. These weren't. The reason is actually a bit more wholesome than one would think. People call it a graveyard because of how many are there and how many are in rough shape, but technically speaking, these streetcars aren't abandoned at all. The property has a specific owner who put the streetcars there for a very specific and actually legitimately good purpose. His name is Ed Metka, and the actual name for the spot is not a graveyard. He calls it the Vintage Electric Streetcar Company. Ed has purchased a bunch of different streetcars, nearly 50 to be precise, for the specific purpose to personally restore them and to keep them from becoming scrapped. There have actually been times where tours were offered by Ed himself for the area so people could come in and see his collection. But it seems a lot harder to do that these days. Many sources online say they've managed to get tours, but it wasn't necessarily an easy thing to do. Also, there are plenty of people on Facebook who were asking one of the posts I saw about it, how to do it, and nobody had an answer. So I'm not sure how best to go about getting a proper tour of this particular spot, if it's even possible at all, because I can assure you this is private property that is owned by Mr. Metka, and he has had a history of dealing with vandals and graffiti artists, damaging his collection even further than it already is. I think Ed's big issue is just that he's effectively doing all this himself. Based on some of the articles written by people who did get tours, some of the cars are actually under shelter, and at least one has seen some work done on it when it comes to preserving it and restoring it. The area is actually pretty big, so in theory with enough money, Mr. Metka could restore all of his collection if he wanted to, but time marches on, and getting enough money to actually restore some of these is a difficult task. Even heritage lines, popular ones, have trouble doing it, and it could take years of collecting donations and solid work in order to restore just one of these cars, and many of them are forced to sit out and wait for a restoration that may never come, unless of course Ed Metka decides to do something different with them. I don't know what his plans are, they're his, I understand that, and I think his heart is definitely in the right place. I commend him for saving these cherished pieces of railroad history. These streetcars are things that would have been lost had he not purchased them. Someone else may not have been able to, and they would have just been thrown away, scrapped. But in this case, they do have a chance to be saved, and that's because of him. If it were me, I don't know if Ed's watching this, he probably isn't, but maybe he is. If you are, Mr. Metka, I would suggest perhaps, I don't know, contact trolley museums all over the place. There's the Washington Trolley Museum, which isn't that far away. They have a great reputation. I can vouch for them myself. I've been there many, many, many times over the years. Maybe they're willing to take some. I don't know if you want to sell them or donate them or what you really plan on doing, but I don't think you want this collection to be lost at any rate. You definitely want these preserved, and I can see that. Also, if you are watching it, how do I get a tour? Because I'd love to see what pieces you have in your collection. I'm just throwing it out there. And with that, a special thank you goes out to all my underwater train finders: Thomas Ward, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Sundew267, Orange Glass, Joshua Long, Ohio Trucker 1, Royal Hudson 2860, Lord Hoth 444, Arthur Roy, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Mr. Black Rose, Master of None Josh Johnson, Twin Fox, Dimeblade 17, Anzac A1, Alaric Jaspers, DM Tribal Typhoon, Tommy Rossini, Jack Carson's Railroad Videos, and Ty Hammonds Jr. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.